The Ritz-Carlton Manhattan shimmered that night, with its usual blend of polished marble, glittering chandeliers, and murmurs of wealth echoing through its high ceilings. Elena Ramirez, dressed in her crisp uniform, balanced a silver tray of late-night room service as she walked the carpeted corridor. She had worked there long enough to know how to keep her head down, eyes lowered steps, measured voice quiet. Guests of this hotel did not look at her unless they wanted to complain, and Elena preferred it that way. Tonight, however, was different. The guest in suite 512 was already drunk before she arrived with the tray. She knocked politely, and the door swung open with a force that made her stumble. The smell of whiskey hit her nose strong and sour as the man in a half-unbuttoned shirt stared at her with glassy eyes. He mumbled something incoherent and waved her inside. Elena set the tray on the table, hoping to leave quickly, but his hand suddenly clamped around her wrist. She froze, her heart kicking against her ribs. The man's grip was heavy, his laugh coarse. He leaned too close words, slurring about how pretty she looked, how no one would miss a maid for a few minutes. Elena pulled back, whispering that she had to return to her shift, but his fingers tightened. Panic spread like fire in her chest. With one desperate yank, she tore her arm free and stumbled toward the door. He cursed, reaching again, but Elena shoved the tray aside and bolted into the hallway. Her breath came sharp as she ran down the carpet, clutching the edge of her uniform as if it could protect her. She glanced back, once saw him stagger into the hall, and turned blindly toward the elevator. The numbers on the doors blurred in her panic. She needed somewhere to hide anywhere until he gave up. Her shaking hand pushed against the nearest handle, and to her surprise, the door opened. Elena slipped inside, pressing the door shut behind her. The room was darker, quieter, the air scented faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. She turned ready to apologize to whatever guest she had just disturbed, but her heel caught on the edge of the rug. The tray she had carried clattered to the floor, and with a gasp she fell forward. Her dress strap slid off her shoulder, the fabric tugging low, as she landed against the edge of a sofa. A man rose from the armchair across the room, his posture sharp, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Alexander Cain, CEO of Cain Holdings, had been reviewing documents when the door burst open. He stood now tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored shirt, his eyes locked on the trembling girl on the floor. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Elena scrambled upright, yanking her strap back over her shoulder cheeks, burning with shame. She stammered an apology, voice breaking, as she begged him not to call security, not to tell her manager. She explained in fragments that she was not trespassing, that she had only been running. Her words tangled with her quick breaths, and her eyes shimmered with the fear of someone who had too often been powerless. Alexander's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, though his face remained composed. He was used to elegance, to manipulation, to people who wore masks in front of him. But this girl with her flushed cheeks and wide eyes was no performance. Her innocence clung to her in the silence more clearly than perfume or jewels ever could. Elena pressed herself back against the sofa, fingers clutching the hem of her dress as though it could shield her. She could not seem to breathe in the heavy quiet of the room. The distance between them felt alive, charged, as though the very air trembled. She dared to lift her gaze, and their eyes met. Heat prickled along her skin. His stare was not cruel, not mocking, but steady, unwavering, too intense to endure. Her lips parted to apologize again, to explain, to beg, but no sound came. Her throat locked. Alexander took one step closer, not threatening but deliberate. His presence filled the space until Elena's heart thudded against her ribs, loud enough for her to hear. The world narrowed to his eyes, her breath, and the silent thunder between them. She thought he might tell her to leave, might call the front desk, might dismiss her as nothing. Instead, he spoke one word low and certain, a command without sharpness, a decision without explanation. Wait. The word lingered in the air, deeper than the silence pulling her still. And in that single moment, Elena knew her life had crossed into something she could never walk away from again. Alexander Cain had built his life like a fortress, each stone placed with precision, each wall designed to keep chaos out. At 34, he stood at the head of Cain Holdings, a global empire that touched everything from shipping to real estate to cutting-edge technology. In boardrooms, his voice was measured. His words carried the weight of certainty, and his reputation was that of a man who did not bend. To outsiders, he appeared untouchable, the kind of billionaire whose life was scripted to perfection, but Alexander knew better. He understood that control was not a luxury, it was survival. Raised in a family where mistakes were never forgiven, he had learned early to hide every crack in his armor. His father, Richard Cain, was a man of iron rules who measured success, not in affection, but in achievements. His mother, soft and warm, had been the only balance in that house of stone, but she died when Alexander was barely a teenager. Her absence left a hollow silence that was quickly filled with expectations and commands. By the time he entered Harvard, Alexander had already mastered the art of hiding pain. Behind straight posture and sharp answers, he excelled not because he loved the work, but because failure was never an option. His life became a schedule of early mornings, late nights, endless contracts and handshakes with men who smiled too easily. Love, romance, intimacy. Those belonged to a world he had locked away, convinced that feelings only made men weak. His companions were transactions, relationships that began and ended on his terms, always clear, always distant. He had never crossed a line he could not control. And yet, in that darkened suite with Elena trembling before him, Alexander felt something he could not categorize. It unsettled him that a single frightened girl in a rumpled uniform could shake the order he had fought to maintain. His empire stretched across continents, his name opened doors in every capital city. But none of that protected him from the disquiet that stirred in his chest when he saw her innocence laid bare. For years he had believed the world was predictable if you had enough money and enough power. Tonight he realized unpredictability had a face, a voice, and eyes that held no calculation, only fear. Something in him, a part long buried under layers of discipline, recognized her. He told himself it was a momentary lapse, that by morning she would be gone, and the rhythm of his controlled existence would resume. But as he stood in that room, the air heavy with unspoken questions, Alexander knew the truth he could not yet admit aloud. He was already stepping over a boundary he had sworn never to cross. And for a man who lived by rules, that realization was as dangerous as it was undeniable. Elena Ramirez was 22 and already carried more weight on her shoulders than most people twice her age. Every morning she woke before dawn in a cramped apartment in Queens. slipping into the same worn shoes and patched uniform before catching the subway into Manhattan. Her job at the Ritz-Carlton was supposed to be temporary, just another way to cover tuition and keep food on the table for her younger brother, but temporary had stretched into years. Her mother had died when Elena was 16, leaving behind debts and a fragile family that crumbled quickly under the strain. Her father drowned his grief in alcohol, drifting in and out of their lives until the law finally pulled him away. That left Elena with Matteo barely a boy, then now a teenager with a smile that could still light her darkest days. She had promised herself that he would never feel abandoned, that she would protect him from every sharp edge of the world, no matter what it cost her. Work was exhausting, school was relentless, but Elena never allowed herself to stop. Each paycheck went first to rent, then to groceries, then to Matteo's medicine, and only last to her own needs. She often skipped meals so he would not have to, and though she dreamed of studying literature or law, she knew dreams did not keep the lights on. What she wanted most was simple, a safe home, a chance for her brother to grow up without fear, and maybe one day, the freedom to breathe without counting every dollar. People at the hotel rarely saw her as more than a uniform. To them, she was just another service worker, invisible until needed, disposable when inconvenient. Elena had learned to move quietly, to smile politely, to fade into the background. That invisibility kept her safe, or so she believed, until the night she ran into Alexander Cain's suite. She had grown used to avoiding trouble, to keeping her head down, but trouble always seemed to find her. Still beneath the quiet obedience lived a resilience that refused to break. Her teachers used to say she had eyes too serious for someone so young, eyes that seemed to carry whole stories without words. Those eyes had watched Matteo sleep, through fevers had read, borrowed books by dim lamplight, had memorized subway schedules like prayers. And yet, for all her hardships, Elena had not lost her tenderness. She still paused to feed stray cats near her building, still shared her lunch with coworkers who forgot theirs, still whispered encouragement to Matteo when the world seemed too heavy for him. She was fragile and fierce at once, a contradiction carved by survival. To Alexander, she might have looked small and insignificant that night, but Elena knew what it meant to endure. What she did not know, as she stood trembling in his suite, was that her quiet existence was about to collide with a man whose life was the opposite of hers, and that nothing about either of them would remain untouched. The morning after that chaotic night, Elena convinced herself it would vanish like a bad dream. She returned to work with her hair tied neatly and her uniform pressed, forcing her hands to steady as she carried trays and delivered towels. She avoided the upper floors where the suites sprawled like palaces, choosing instead to volunteer for laundry runs and kitchen duty. She told herself that if she kept her distance, if she moved carefully enough, the memory of Alexander Cain, watching her stumble into his room with her dress sliding from her shoulder, would fade into nothing. But fate, as always, did not care about her plans. 3 days later, she was assigned to deliver coffee to the executive lounge. She balanced the silver tray with practiced ease, her eyes fixed on the carpet as she entered, and when she lifted her gaze, she froze. Alexander was there, seated near the window, his phone in one hand, his posture sharp as if carved from stone. His eyes lifted locked with hers, and for a moment Elena forgot how to breathe. She nearly spilled the tray, but he rose before she could falter, taking the coffee from her hands without a word. His fingers brushed hers lightly, and the brief touch sent a jolt through her veins. She pulled back quickly, murmuring thank you, and turned to leave. His voice stopped her, quiet, measured, unmistakably direct. Wait. She stiffened the same word, echoing as it had that night. Slowly she turned back. He studied her with a gaze that was neither cruel nor indulgent, only searching. Finally he asked if she was all right. The question seemed simple, but it carried a weight that unsettled her. Elena nodded too quickly and fled, her pulse racing. That evening she told herself again to avoid him, but avoiding him became impossible. Somehow he appeared in the quiet corridors when she was cleaning in the lobby, when she signed off shifts in the rain one evening, when her umbrella snapped in the wind. She had been shivering, clutching her jacket close, when a shadow stretched over her. Alexander held an umbrella above them, both his tailored suit speckled with raindrops, his expression unreadable. He walked her to the subway without a word, but the silence between them felt less like distance and more like something unspoken. The next week she sat in a cafe near campus, counting coins to see if she could afford a small cup before class. A hand appeared beside hers, setting down a bill. She looked up, startled, to see him standing there, calm, composed, insisting without insisting that the coffee was on him. She tried to protest, but his gaze silenced her. She accepted the cup warmth spreading through her fingers and her chest in equal measure. Their encounters piled like stones, building something neither wanted to name. Alexander found himself seeking her without realizing it, leaving meetings earlier than usual, stepping into hallways where he knew she would be. Elena began to notice the shift in her own breath when she caught sight of him, the flutter in her stomach, when his eyes lingered a second too long. He did not smile often, but when his lips curved slightly in her direction, she felt as if the world tilted. Sexual tension hummed between them, subtle yet undeniable. A brush of his hand against hers, as he passed her a folder, the way she lowered her gaze, when his eyes stayed too long on her face. The silence that stretched just a heartbeat longer than necessary. She told herself he was a billionaire, untouchable, impossible, and she was just a hotel maid scraping coins for coffee. And yet her heart betrayed her logic. One night she found herself alone on the service floor, wiping tables after a long event. Alexander appeared at the doorway, still in his suit, though his tie was loosened. He did not speak at first, only watched her. Finally he said softly that she should not work so late. She replied that she had no choice. He stepped closer, the air between them heavy again. She could feel her pulse in her throat. His eyes lingered on her, as if memorizing her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. For once, she did not look away. Their breaths mingled in the quiet, and for a fleeting second, it felt as if the world balanced on the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. Then she gathered her things, whispered good night, and left before the line was crossed. That night she lay awake in her small apartment, Matteo asleep in the next room, her heart still racing with the memory of his nearness. She pressed her hands to her face and told herself it could not happen, it must not happen. But even as she repeated the words, she knew she was waiting for the next time their paths would collide. And Alexander, alone in his penthouse staring out at the glittering city skyline, knew with a clarity that unsettled him that he would make sure their paths did collide again. Elena tried to convince herself that what had happened so far were coincidences, that Alexander Cain had no reason to notice her, that the umbrella in the rain, the coffee in the cafe, the quiet word in the service corridor were nothing more than accidents of proximity. Yet the more she tried to rationalize, the more the truth pressed in on her. He was noticing her deliberately consistently, and it terrified her as much as it stirred something she had never dared to feel. They began to speak in stolen fragments of time, moments that slipped through the cracks of his empire and her long shifts. One afternoon, he lingered near the staff exit as she folded her apron. He asked about the book tucked into her bag, and she hesitated before admitting it was a second-hand copy of poetry. He surprised her by reciting a line perfectly from memory. She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, a man of wealth, and headlines quoting words that lived in the quiet corners of her heart. Another evening she found him in the staff cafeteria, of all places sitting across from her, with a tray of untouched food. She asked why he was there, and he shrugged lightly, saying the silence felt better than another gala. They spoke of ordinary things, her brother's schoolwork, his restless nights, her fear of subway delays, his dislike for pretense. It was strange, surreal, to hear a billionaire confess that he sometimes felt lonelier surrounded by people than she did alone. Slowly the layers peeled back. Elena confessed that she had always been invisible, that it was safer that way. Alexander admitted that he had always been visible, too visible, trapped by expectations. Their words twined together like threads from opposite ends of a loom, weaving a pattern neither had expected. Then came the twist she did not anticipate. One evening, as they walked past the hotel's ballroom, she paused at a display of photographs from past charity events. Among the glossy frames she saw a picture nearly a decade old. In it, a younger Alexander, barely in his 20s, stood with a group of children at a Christmas donation drive. He wore the same controlled smile she had come to know, but his eyes looked younger, less shadowed. Elena's breath caught as she pointed to a thin girl in the corner of the frame, holding a small gift bag. It was her. She remembered the day vividly, the way a stranger in a perfect suit had bent low to hand her a wrapped toy, the way she had clutched it as if it were treasure. She whispered the memory aloud, and Alexander's eyes widened. For a man who did not believe in coincidences, the realization struck deep. He studied the photo, then her, and for a moment his composure faltered. He admitted he barely remembered that day, one of hundreds of obligatory appearances. Yet the idea that their paths had crossed before unsettled him profoundly. Elena felt the same, as if some invisible thread had always been pulling them toward this collision. From that night their conversations carried a different weight. They spoke not only of the present, but of what it meant that their lives had brushed once before. Alexander found himself thinking of her long after she left the room, the sound of her laughter slipping into the silence of his penthouse. Elena caught herself waiting for him in places she should not, her heart betraying her better judgment. The small details grew into unspoken intimacy. She brought him leftover pastries from the kitchen one night, shyly offering them in the empty rooftop garden. He surprised her with 2 cups of coffee, black and steaming, and they sat beneath the city lights, sharing crumbs and words, until the cold drove them closer together. He told her about his mother, the way her absence had left a void that no amount of success could fill. She told him about Matteo, about how his smile made every sacrifice worth it. When the wind grew sharper, she shivered, and he placed his jacket over her shoulders without a word. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and the silence between them pulsed with something fragile and fierce. Neither leaned forward, neither confessed, but the closeness wrapped around them like a secret. Each encounter pulled them further from the boundaries they had once guarded so tightly. For Alexander, the line between control and surrender blurred. For Elena, the line between fear and longing blurred, and as they sat together one night, watching the skyline flicker like a sea of restless stars, both understood without speaking that whatever force had once brushed their lives together had returned with purpose. Whether they wanted it or not, their worlds were no longer separate. They were already entwined, and the thread between them was pulling tighter with every breath they shared. Alexander had never been a man who offered pieces of his history freely, but in the quiet corners where Elena stood, words came easier than he expected. One evening he invited her to the rooftop again. The city sprawled beneath them like a restless sea of light. He told her about his father Richard, a man who had raised him with an iron fist and colder words, a man who saw affection as weakness and achievement as the only currency that mattered. Alexander spoke of the pressure of inheriting Cain holdings of Harvard, nights spent buried in books not out of love, but out of fear of failure of boardrooms, where he had learned to sharpen his voice until no one could hear the boy beneath it. Elena listened, her eyes steady her silence, a kind of balm that eased the sharp edges of his confessions. When he finished, she did not pity him, and that startled him more than any reaction could have. She simply said that she understood what it meant to live under someone else's expectations until you forgot what your own voice sounded like. Then she told him her story. It spilled out more slowly, halting at times, as though each word cost her something. Her father had been a kind man once before alcohol consumed him. After her mother's death, he became a stranger, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, leaving Elena to hold their family together with hands too small for the task. She described nights when she shielded Matteo from the sound of broken bottles, mornings when she pretended everything was fine so he could go to school with a smile. She spoke of neighbors who judged her teachers, who lowered their expectations, friends who vanished when life became too messy. By the time she finished, Alexander's jaw was tight, his hands curled in restrained fury, not at her but at a world that had demanded so much from someone who deserved so little pain. Elena smiled faintly, insisting she was fine, that she had learned to be strong. But Alexander saw the truth beneath her calm, the exhaustion of survival etched into her. For the first time in his life, he wanted to fight not for a company, not for profit, but for a person. The realization unsettled him. He had sworn to live with boundaries, to keep his world neat and controllable. But here was Elena, unraveling everything with nothing more than honesty and resilience. It was then he recognized that he was already crossing a line. What began as curiosity had become attachment. What began as accidental encounters had become something he could no longer file away as coincidence. And with attachment came danger. He knew the world he inhabited was not kind. Business rivals searched for weaknesses. Board members dissected every move. The press sharpened their knives at the first whiff of scandal. A billionaire seen with a maid was not a romance to them, it was a headline dripping with ridicule. Yet when he looked at her, he found himself unable to care. She shifted the air around him, made him question choices he had once believed were absolute. That night, as he walked her to the subway, he caught himself studying the way her hair caught the glow of the streetlights, the way her hand tightened around her worn bag, the way she glanced at him as if she could not decide whether to run or to stay. He wanted to reach for her to bridge the last space between them, but he held back, afraid of shattering what was still too fragile to name. Elena herself was no less conflicted. She told herself over and over that she could not afford distraction, that Matteo needed her, that love stories belonged to movies and novels, not to girls who scrubbed floors and counted coins. But she felt the tremor in her chest each time Alexander appeared, the warmth that spread through her when his voice softened just for her. She hated how much she noticed, how much she remembered the brush of his hand against hers, the weight of his jacket on her shoulders, the depth of his eyes when he listened. She had promised herself never to depend on anyone, and yet she found herself wanting to lean into the steadiness he carried like armor. One evening, while she folded laundry in the hotel's staff room, she discovered a small gift tucked into her basket, a book, its cover slightly worn, a volume of poetry she had once mentioned. Inside was a note in precise handwriting for nights when words are the only warmth. She pressed the book to her chest, torn between gratitude and fear. He was breaking through her defenses, and she was letting him. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that a man like Alexander Cain could never mean it. But deep down she knew he was already rewriting the rules of his life and dragging her heart into the center of it. The past had shaped them both into survivors, but now standing on the edge of something new. Elena realized that survival alone would no longer be enough. She wanted more, and for the first time, she dared to imagine that he might want the same. Neither of them spoke the word love, not yet, but it hovered unspoken, trembling, like a secret waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And as the days slipped by, as their stolen conversations grew longer, as their silences grew heavier with meaning, both Alexander and Elena knew with a clarity that frightened them that the past was not done with them. Secrets had a way of resurfacing, and the deeper their bond grew, the more dangerous those secrets would become. The fragile balance they had built did not last. Whispers began to spread through the polished corridors of Cain Holdings. Whispers that the untouchable Alexander Cain was spending too much time in places he never visited before. Whispers that he was seen walking with a young maid, his gaze softer than anyone had ever known. In boardrooms filled with sharp suits and sharper eyes, the murmurs turned into questions, and questions turned into suspicion. The board of directors had weathered scandals before, but never one that threatened the image of their CEO. They gathered behind closed doors, pointing to contracts with investors who cared about reputation, not truth, warning that the company could not afford gossip that painted Alexander as reckless. Alexander listened in silence as they delivered their warnings, his face unreadable. But beneath the surface a storm gathered. He was not a man accustomed to being told what to feel, and the thought of them dictating his heart filled him with an anger he carefully concealed. For Elena, the storm came in another form. One evening she was summoned to the suite of a wealthy foreign guest, a man known for his temper and indulgence. She entered with careful politeness, tray in hand, only to find the man waiting with a smirk. On the table beside him lay an open jewelry case, and when she placed the tray down, he reached out, insisting she try on a diamond bracelet. Elena declined softly, backing away, but the man pressed the bracelet into her hand. The door opened suddenly, and Alexander stepped in his presence, sharp and cold. He had come to finalize a discussion with the guest about an upcoming deal, but instead he found Elena, cornered, her face pale, the bracelet glinting like a trap in her trembling hand. The guest smirked, claiming she had tried to pocket the jewel. Within minutes, hotel security was called, and by the time Elena stumbled into the staff corridor, the rumor had already started. A maid caught stealing from a guest a girl too close to the billionaire CEO. By morning, tabloids ran, with headlines words like gold digger and thief splashed across their pages. Elena felt the world crumble beneath her feet. She sat in the manager's office, her heart pounding as accusations flew her job on the line. Her reputation shredded by lies she could not disprove. She wanted to scream, to fight, but fear pressed the air from her lungs. For Alexander, the choice arrived swiftly, as brutal as any merger he had ever faced. His board demanded he distance himself immediately, to let the girl take the fall, so the company's name could remain untarnished. They reminded him of pending deals worth billions, investors who would not forgive weakness rivals, waiting to devour them at the first sign of scandal. Alexander listened, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so firmly the knuckles whitened. He could protect the empire his father had built, the empire he had sworn to expand, or he could protect the girl who had walked into his suite by mistake and stolen more than his attention. The empire meant legacy, power, order. Elena meant chaos, risk, vulnerability. And yet, when he pictured her eyes wet with humiliation, her voice trembling as she begged not to be reported, the choice no longer felt like a choice at all. He stood before the board and told them calmly that he would not abandon her. He told them the truth, that she was innocent, that she had been framed, that if the company's future could be destroyed by his defense of what was right, then perhaps the company deserved to fall. Gasps echoed around the room, but Alexander did not flinch. Outside, the glass towers of the city glittered like indifferent stars, but within him a line had been crossed that could never be retraced. For Elena, hearing that he had spoken on her behalf, was both salvation and terror. It meant she was no longer alone, but it also meant his world, vast and dangerous, would now turn its full gaze upon her. Strangers whispered her name in hallways, newspapers hunted her past, photographers waited outside her building. She wanted to disappear, to shield Matteo from the chaos, but Alexander appeared at her door, his presence steady, his voice low. He told her she was not alone, that he would stand with her no matter the cost. And in his eyes she saw not pity, but conviction. It terrified her more than the accusations, because she had never been worth such loyalty before. But Alexander had already chosen, and that choice carried consequences neither of them could yet imagine. The scandal did not fade. Investors pulled back the board, pressed harder, and competitors circled like sharks sensing blood. But none of that compared to the threat that moved silently in the shadows. A rival businessman, Victor Hale, had long despised Alexander, jealous of his control over lucrative shipping routes and government contracts. To Victor, the rumors of Alexander's entanglement with a maid were not simply scandal, They were opportunity. If Cain Holdings stumbled, Victor would be there to claim the pieces. And if Alexander would not bend, Victor would force him. The warning came in the form of a message slipped under Alexander's penthouse door. It was simple, handwritten, unsigned: walk away from her, or she will not walk away at all. Alexander read it twice, his eyes dark, his fist tightening around the paper, until it tore. He increased security immediately, but Elena noticed the changes. Men in dark suits lingered near the hotel. Entrance cars trailed her on her way to school, and every night Alexander insisted on driving her home himself. She wanted to protest, to tell him she could take care of herself. But the seriousness in his voice silenced her. He was not being cautious, he was preparing for war. The blow fell one evening when Elena left her shift carrying a bag of groceries for Matteo. The street was quiet, the air heavy when a van pulled up beside her. Hands grabbed her before she could scream, the bag spilling apples across the pavement. She fought, clawing, but the chloroform was swift. Hours later, she awoke in a dim warehouse. Her wrists bound, the metallic taste of fear sharp on her tongue. Men she did not recognize circled, their eyes cold. One spoke, telling her calmly that she was leverage, nothing more, a pawn to make Alexander Cain sign away control of a contract worth billions. Elena's heart pounded as she thought of Matteo, of Alexander, of the cruel twist that her life, once invisible, now carried a price. Alexander received the call at midnight. The voice was low, distorted, demanding his signature on a deal that would gut Cain Holdings of its strongest assets. In exchange, Elena would live. If he refused, she would vanish. Alexander felt the world still around him, the hum of the city fading until only her name remained in his chest. For years he had fought to protect his empire, but in that moment he knew an empire meant nothing without her. He activated his private security men, trained for situations the world never saw. He coordinated with law enforcement, but he made it clear he would be there himself. At dawn, the operation began. The warehouse was surrounded, silently, teams moving like shadows. Alexander entered through the side, his face carved from steel, his body thrumming with a fear he refused to show. He found her in the center of the room, tied to a chair, her eyes aged but unbroken. When their gazes met across the distance, something fierce surged in him. He had been called ruthless, cold, untouchable, but in that instant he was simply a man who could not lose the woman he loved. Chaos erupted as guards realized the breach. Shots rang boots, thundered shouts filled the air. Alexander moved through it with terrifying focus. Every step calculated, every strike precise. He reached Elena, cutting her free as she whispered his name. Her voice cracked but alive. He pulled her against him, shielding her with his body as they moved toward the exit. A blow caught his shoulder, pain searing, but he did not falter. She clung to him, her breath ragged against his chest as he forced their way through the storm. By the time the police secured the building, Victor's men were subdued, some arrested, others fleeing into the night. Alexander stood outside in the cold dawn light, his shirt stained, Elena wrapped in his jacket, trembling but safe. Paramedics urged her into an ambulance, but she refused to release his hand. In the hospital room, hours later, she lay in bed, her wrists bruised, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Alexander sat beside her, his arm bandaged, his expression softer than she had ever seen. He took her hand, pressing it to his lips, and whispered words he had never spoken before. I cannot lose you. Not to them, not to anyone, not to fear. For a man who had once believed feelings were weakness, the confession felt like the most powerful truth he had ever owned. Elena, her eyes filling with tears, tightened her grip. For the first time since her mother's death, she allowed herself to believe that she was no longer fighting alone. The days after the rescue blurred into a rhythm of recovery and reckoning. Elena healed slowly, her wrists wrapped in bandages, the memory of ropes still burning on her skin. Alexander visited every day, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with books, always with a steady presence that anchored her. The nurses whispered about the billionaire who refused to leave the side of a maid, but neither of them cared. For the first time since their collision, they were no longer pretending that what bound them could be ignored. Yet outside those hospital walls, the world roared. News outlets spun stories of abduction, and conspiracy tabloids splashed Elena's name across glossy covers. Board members demanded explanations. Investors threatened to withdraw, pointing to the chaos as proof that Alexander had lost control. The pressure was relentless, but Alexander faced it with a calm that startled even himself. At a press conference, he stood before the cameras, his voice steady, as he admitted that Elena Ramirez was not a scandal, not a mistake, but someone he refused to abandon. He acknowledged corruption within contracts the company had pursued, declaring that Cain Holdings would sever ties even if it cost billions. The media erupted, analysts called it reckless, competitors laughed. But ordinary people watched with unexpected admiration. For once, a billionaire had chosen conscience over profit, and the world took notice. Elena watched the broadcast from her hospital bed, her chest tight, her throat aching. She had feared he might regret, might distance himself to protect what he had built, but instead he had stepped into the fire for her. That night he returned tired but unshaken, and told her that nothing mattered more than her safety and her truth. She believed him, and it terrified her with its tenderness. When she was discharged, he did not let her return to her small apartment. He brought her and Mateo into a secure townhouse, guarded discreetly but firmly. At first, she resisted, worried that she was dragging her brother into a world too sharp for them, but the relief on Mateo's face when he saw a bedroom of his own was undeniable. Alexander even tried to cook for them one evening, clattering pans and overcooked spaghetti. A disaster that left the kitchen smoky, and Elena laughing until tears spilled down her cheeks. It was imperfect, awkward, but it was real. And in that laughter, Alexander felt something shift permanently inside him. The board continued to press warning that his personal choices endangered everything they had built. Alexander listened, then calmly announced that leadership was not about preserving profit at any cost, but about protecting integrity. If that meant stepping down, he was prepared. The board fell silent, shocked, realizing too late that his power came not just from his title, but from the loyalty he commanded. Meanwhile, Elena faced her own transformation. Once invisible, she now carried the weight of headlines, strangers debating her worth as if she were a commodity. She hated it, but she also understood she could no longer run from it. With Alexander's encouragement, she applied for a scholarship program tied to legal studies, determined to use her voice for others who had been silenced. When the acceptance letter arrived, she clutched it to her chest, overwhelmed. Knowing it was a doorway she never thought she would open. The night she shared the news, Alexander took her hand and said softly that he had never been prouder of anyone. It was in that moment she realized he was no longer a man. She feared losing, but a man she had chosen to walk beside. Their bond deepened in the quiet, in the evenings when they read together, on the balcony in the mornings when he poured her coffee, before his meetings in the way Matteo began to look at Alexander not as a stranger but as someone he could trust. Love did not come in declarations or grand gestures, but in the consistency of presence, in the choice to stay despite the storm. Alexander had once believed boundaries kept him safe, but now he understood that safety lay in vulnerability, in letting someone see the truth beneath the armor. Elena had once believed invisibility kept her alive, but now she saw that being seen by the right person was its own kind of salvation. Together they forged a life that was not free of danger or scrutiny, but it was theirs built on defiance, tenderness, and a quiet resolve to keep choosing each other no matter the cost. And as the city buzzed with gossip and deals in the townhouse, where laughter now echoed against once silent walls, Alexander and Elena knew they had crossed the line long ago, and neither of them would ever walk back. A year later, the chaos that had once consumed their lives felt like a distant storm, its echoes softened by time and by the choices they had made. Elena walked across the stage of her university auditorium. Her cap slightly crooked her gown, flowing as applause rose around her. Matteo cheered from the front row, his voice breaking with pride, while Alexander stood beside him, hands clasped, his eyes never leaving her. She clutched her diploma as though it were more than paper, as though it were proof that survival could transform into triumph. That evening they celebrated in the townhouse that had long since become their home. Matteo beamed as he showed Alexander his latest report card, and Alexander ruffled his hair in a way that made the boy grin even wider. Elena watched them, her heart swelling with a tenderness she had never believed she would know a family born not from blood but from choice. Outside the world had changed too. Cain Holdings had weathered its losses and emerged leaner with contracts grounded in transparency rather than greed. Alexander had stepped into the role of a leader admired not just for his wealth, but for his integrity. The press still hounded them at times, but the story of the billionaire who chose a maid over an empire had shifted into something softer, something almost fairy tale. His board, once hostile, had quieted some out of respect others, because his gamble had restored public trust. Yet none of that mattered compared to what unfolded on a rooftop in New York, beneath the glow of 1,000 city lights. Alexander led Elena there one evening, the same rooftop, where he had once listened to her stories and handed her coffee in paper cups. This time he carried a small velvet box in his pocket, his heart steady but fierce. Elena stood at the edge, the wind lifting her hair, the city sprawling infinite behind her. When he took her hand, she turned her eyes wide with the same innocence that had first unraveled him, but now tempered with the strength of all they had endured together. He knelt not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as someone stripped bare of titles, offering his heart without armor. He told her she had given him more than love she had given him, a reason to live beyond survival, beyond legacy. He told her that wealth could build towers, but only she could make a home. Elena's tears glimmered as he opened the box to reveal a simple ring, elegant but unpretentious, a symbol not of status but of devotion. She whispered yes before he could even finish asking, her voice trembling with joy. He rose, sliding the ring onto her finger, and when their lips met, the city seemed to fade, leaving only the warmth of two people who had fought through fire to find each other. In the weeks that followed, they planned a small ceremony, nothing grand, just family and close friends. Elena walked down the aisle in a gown borrowed but beautiful Matteo, carrying the rings with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. When they spoke their vows, it was not about promises of perfection, but about choosing each other again and again, even when the world tried to tear them apart. As Alexander kissed his bride, applause erupted, but what mattered most was the look in Elena's eyes, the reflection of everything they had survived and everything they had yet to build. Later, as they danced beneath strings of golden lights, Alexander whispered into her ear that love was not about wealth. It was about who you were willing to fight for. Elena pressed her forehead to his, smiling through tears, knowing those words would carry them into every tomorrow. And when the night ended and the last guests departed, they stood together at the doorway of their new home, Matteo asleep inside the future, stretching vast and uncertain before them. But for the first time in both their lives, the uncertainty was not something to fear. It was a promise. The story of Alexander and Elena was not one of perfect beginnings, but of broken paths that somehow found their way to each other. It began in fear and accident in the sharp edges of a night. Neither had planned, yet it grew into something stronger than either could have imagined. Love did not arrive in grand gestures or flawless days, but in the quiet resilience of two souls who chose again and again not to let go. For Alexander, the man who once measured life by contracts and control love, meant surrendering to vulnerability, allowing himself to feel what he had long buried. For Elena, the girl who had survived invisibility and hardship love meant daring to believe she was worthy of being cherished, not for what she could endure, but simply for who she was. Together they proved that wealth, status, and scandal could not dictate the truth of the heart. Their journey carried them through trials that might have broken others from boardroom battles, to whispered accusations, to the terrifying night when Elena was taken. Yet through every moment, choice by choice, they built something unshakable. And when the world doubted them, they answered not with words, but with steadfast presence, with loyalty that no headline could diminish. Their ending was not just a wedding beneath golden lights, nor a rooftop proposal overlooking the city. It was the life they stepped into afterward, a life filled with Matteo's laughter, with mornings of coffee poured by steady hands, with evenings where silence felt safe instead of heavy. It was a life where Alexander's power no longer came from titles, but from tenderness, and where Elena's strength no longer came from invisibility, but from being seen. Theirs was a love that crossed lines, not recklessly, but courageously, a reminder that sometimes the rules we live by are the very cages that keep us from happiness. And for anyone listening, their story whispers a truth. We all long to hear that love, when chosen with courage, can defy even the most unyielding of worlds. Now, dear listener, as you reflect on their journey, ask yourself, would you have made the same choice? Alexander did, risking empire for love, trading power, for the chance to hold on to someone real, or would fear have kept you behind the walls of control? Your answer matters, because stories like this are not only about billionaires and maids, but about all of us, about the lines we are willing to cross for the people who matter. If this story moved you, if it made your heart race in the tense moments and soften in the tender ones, then let us know. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you are listening from, whether it is a quiet kitchen in Texas, a bus ride in New York, or a living room across the ocean. Your voice is part of this journey too. And if you believe, as Alexander and Elena showed us, that love is worth every battle, then help us spread these stories. Subscribe to this channel, turn on the notifications, and stay with us for more tales of hearts colliding in the most unexpected ways. Each story we tell is a reminder that no matter how sharp the world may seem, there is always room for tenderness, for forgiveness, for courage, and for the kind of love that refuses to let go. So until the next story, hold on to the lesson of this one. Love is not about wealth, it is about who you are willing to fight for. And sometimes when you least expect it, love will walk into your life like a storm and leave you changed forever.